Queenie, or Queen of Filth, which is a name I don't actually like. My ex invented not just a name, but an entire persona, and I told him not to, and it's just horrible. Or Dani Brown. You can search my books, my social media under Dani Brown, but I will post the link down. And welcome back to story time. Now today we are going to cleanse our palate a bit after Necrosutra 2 and Papa's Golden Shower with Amanda M. Lyons. So I hope everybody's had their needed therapy after those two stories. Sorry, I find it because we are on a different app now. We're in a Kindle app. We have to go back all the way back to the first page. I wanted to see how long it was. So I'm getting there. I don't know if there's a way to quickly do this because I don't often use Kindle, especially on my iPad. When I am reading, I read on my phone. My son has been going off at me because of my books, which I've got books everywhere because I prefer paperback. But with some of these are being sent in to me, which is just a bit easier. And then with Godless, obviously only being ebooks, and they're really cheap, and most of them are quite short, so I can read them at dinner. Some of them, Rain Havoc, I'm looking at you. You ruined the meal for me with was it Mukbang Princess? Rain, you owe me dinner. So, but we're going to cleanse our palates now with Amanda M. Lyons, who if you missed my other one on hers, I didn't do too much of her book that she sent because I was just so tired. She used to edit, she was an editor at a publisher that published me. I think she edited the first edition of Ketamine Addicted Pandas. I think, I'm not entirely sure though, but she was a damn good editor. She's a really good writer. So we've got Haint Blue and Alley Laughter Tale by Amanda M. Lyons. So I'll post all of her links down below so you can check her out, especially if you need a palate cleanse after some of the more extreme stuff that comes on here or that I'm sure you're reading, particularly those of you in Latin America. You guys like your splatter and your extreme and your grossness, which, by the way, check out some of my books. They have been reviewed in Mexico. Yay! So, give me a minute. I need that nicotine, especially after, I couldn't get a therapist. The NHS waiting lists are like miles and miles long, and by the time I would come up to the top of it, I'm sure Sweeney and Reek would have even worse books out. So I could edit out my vaping, but I've got a lot of editing to do, and I still have to finish writing my Halloween story, so I'm not going to. She was cold by the time she got herself far enough away from Jamie's house and the chaos she left there. Cold and more hungry than she'd probably been since she was small and the food was getting light in her parents' cupboard. She also managed to find herself on foot only a handful of days after she got into Jamie's trunk and fled further up the road and down this one and that one and on until she lost track of where she might be. She supposed her head wound might have been the cause of some of that. It still ached and burned, especially with sweat and the heat of the sun overhead getting into the tender flesh of it as she walked. The truck was somewhere a while back down the way she came now, empty of gas and not much use without it. Maybe that was all right, though, if it hadn't felt right holding on to the last bit of him, even if it was to get free of everything that had happened. Besides, she already managed to find herself partway up in the foothills of the mountain she'd been watching as she drove. Long beyond the limits of the town where she lived. Town would have given her safety and someone to look after her wounds, but being recently widowed by her own hand and the dead man in that burnt-up cabin being the apple of that town's eye, she doubted it would have been safe for very long. She sent up a prayer for the abandoned truck with her eyes shut tight, thanking her lucky stars it had taken her far enough away to feel anything like peace in her heart. The woods and the shadows had upset her for a while. There were plenty of things to dart at with her aching head and bruised ribs still yelling, her nerves still screaming with anxiety whenever she heard an unexpected shift in the grass and leaves around her. But she was adjusting now, getting more in tune with herself. After all, freedom, The space to just exist and be in the world was everything she wanted, wasn't it? Maybe I should just disappear out of here in one of those old cabins, or if something gets me, I think the fight's gone out of me anyway. Least all of it was there in the first place. Allie stopped for a minute to get her bearings. It was chilly now. Now she was nearer the mountains, and with them somewhere to the side of some running water she could hear in the distance. Her stomach growled as she took a seat on an old stump and looked out over the land around her. Mostly it was trees for miles all around, that and wild scrub, fallen leaves, and brown grass. That was well enough. The less predictable, the better. The less unpredictable things were, the better. But what was she going to do to dispel her growling guts? If I knew the woods better, I might see something I could forage, but I never did pick up any of what my granny or uncle was pointing out when I was small. She sighed. Maybe it's time I try remembering. I know they used to say parts of the woods had wild fruit trees growing, old, left-behind trees from someone's orchard from ages ago. Thing is, I don't. That was when her eyes fell on some wood smoke high up on a hill off to her left side, nearly out of her eye line until she turned her body a bit more to take in. Can't hurt to see who's there. Well, unless someone decides to use some buckshot to chase me off anyways. Resigning herself to making the effort, she stood on her sore feet and made her way over to a tangle of dead tree branches. After a few minutes of consideration, she pulled out a nice solid limb she could quickly clean of brittle sticks and then thumped it down against the ground a few times to test it out. It didn't break on contact, and it felt solid enough in her grip, so she carefully used it to pick her way through the weeds and grass between her and the ascent that she'd have to make to find that cabin. She was a good handful of steps on her way when she heard some cracking branches and darting footsteps in the woods off to her left. She froze for a moment, watching the tree line for any sign of movement with a flutter of nervous anxiety in her belly and chest. For a moment, she was worried she was about to be confronted by something dangerous. But when everything settled back into quiet and nothing came forward from the area, she told herself that it was just a deer that let her take a breath and ease her way forward on the path. After all, that was one of the most likely answers, and she'd probably been the one to startle it into running in the first place. It was by no means an easy walk. Even with the walking stick, the path was steep. The ground in front of her went mostly uphill at a near direct angle. All of it stippled with dried out briars and pricker bushes that clung and pulled at her as muddy patches made her slide back due to mushy clay and pooled groundwater hidden under the foliage. Even so, she got herself through her frustrations and over enough ground that she found herself coming up onto a ratty old dirt road a couple of hours after she started. It was clear this must have been the way folks used to get to the old cabin whose smoke had caught her attention, because the path was relatively clear, despite the overgrowth that came up through it here and there. Sore around her ribs and head wound and feeling the strain in her calves and thighs, she lingered there by the road a moment, holding onto her stick and breathing while she kept her ears peeled for anything out of the ordinary, or which might sound at all like private property owners with little interest in visitors. She didn't hear much. A squirrel snagged its way up a tree. A far-off pair of birds squabbled, and what could have been a dog or a coyote made noise off around another hollow or valley somewhere that echoed away. She thought maybe she heard some noise from the cabin by now, but that smoke seemed to be the only indication it even existed. That quiet gave her pause, particularly now that she was closer, but not enough to make her reconsider. Quiet probably meant safe, right? This is a horror story. Allie shrugged off the unknown for now. Hunger and exhaustion were starting to take their toll. The aching pain of exertion had trebled the effort of the pain she was still dealing with from her injuries. Even just sitting on a porch for a bit sounded worth all her effort, and it would be all the better if getting up there meant being anywhere near the cackle of that fire. Surely this person wouldn't begrudge her that, or a ride to someplace else if they liked that better. When she set foot on the road itself, she found that it was soft with mud and wet leaves. As she began to move further along its path, she learned that it got steeper as it went. It was almost straight up as it curved around the bend and seemed to coil up and around again and again, in an ascent that didn't seem as if it had an end in sight for a long while. None of this was encouraging, and she labored at it now that she was closer to the cabin, but she made herself do it anyways. She'd get there soon enough. When she finally reached the top about an hour later, she found she stood on a flat slice of land, the yard taking up a few acres of hard scrabble soil and rock littered with patches of wildflowers and weeds, with old tools and other rusty objects littered around the edges of the drive itself. It seemed apparent that it had been chopped straight into the mountain some time long ago in the past. Tall old growth trees dotted the back of the property and loomed over the cabin that had been built there, protecting it from the wild all around it as they creaked and groaned with the wind. Those trees probably also did a lot of the work of holding the soil of the mountain in place, instead of letting it wash everything away when the heavier rains of the spring and summer came. That wind must howl when it comes down on a hard night in winter. Allie limped over the yard and up the drive, her eyes on the porch steps as she moved. When she arrived near the end of it, she looked up and took in the porch itself, that and the long, thin arms of the woman who sat on the porch, her gnarled hands curled tight around her walking stick, this one much older than the Allie's and made of polished hickory. The rest of her had been in the shadows up till now, but as she leaned forward to stand, Allie could finally see her face. All blue moon eyes and wrinkled brown skin, the lips of her mouth pursed in a tight line as she took measure of her and nodded in acknowledgement. Allie politely nodded back, and the old woman came to the edge of the porch and stood tall and proud to greet her formally. Somehow, Allie wasn't surprised to find she wore an old men's flannel shirt in green and black, and well-worn blue jeans and scuffed black work boots. Her long salt and pepper hair pulled up into a knot at the back of her head. This was a sensible old woman who had grown up knowing there was little need to be fussy when it came to clothes or any other detail orientated towards appearances. "Hello there, girl. What might you be needing now you've come up?" The old woman looked around her yard. Allie noticed that her eyes lingered on a barren ash tree, a mostly empty porch, and the door, which seemed as if it had recently been painted a deep red. She noted all of those things with a look of grim frustration. Her face, squinted tight with concentration and dismay from those other things, softened as she let her eyes fall back on Allie. "Not that those damn kids left me much to work with, mind you. Not much at all." I hope you won't mind. I was hoping to rest on your porch for a while. Maybe ask for a drink. And if you had anything you don't mind sharing with me, a bite to eat. If that's not too much to ask, that is. I've been walking for a while, and I don't have anything with me. I'd offer some help with things if you need it. I don't have money, but I don't mind working for you if you could use a hand. The old woman studied her a while with her face locked in serious consideration. She was being measured up again. It was clear, but there was also something else that drifted in around the old woman's eyes. Something important she had to think about carefully. Allie was rough around the edges, more than a little road weary, and leaning a bit more to the left than normal. But she wasn't sure what else the other woman saw as she looked at her. Was the pain as clear in her eyes as it was in her head? She didn't think too deeply about whatever it was that could be on the woman's mind, but she noted it and hoped it wasn't something that meant danger. In time, the old woman nodded. Then she lifted one of her hands from the hickory cane and flicked her fingers in towards herself, giving permission for entry as she opened the red door to enter. She turned and looked back to see if Allie was coming as she stood in the doorway. Her eyebrow quivered. Then she pressed her lips together and gestured again, a little tersely this time. "You'll need to get a move on, girl. We got things to discuss, you and me, and only so much time to manage what we can. My name's Allie, ma'am." Allie laughed at her. The old woman nodded, satisfied. "And I'm Agnes. Now we're acquainted. Let's go in and warm ourselves. I have a feeling you were sent, Allie, pulled along when you were needed." Agnes went in without another word. Allie hopped up on the porch and toward the open red door. She stopped there for a moment and took an assessing look back at the woods and the yard. There didn't seem to be anything unusual about the yard or anything beyond it, but she'd be lying to herself if she didn't admit she felt the need to be cautious before she crossed the threshold. She supposed she didn't have much choice but to follow where she hoped to go, but she felt it as she shut the door in her wake. That strange, uneasy feeling that she'd come from the frying pan and hopped right into the fire. The old woman placed 2 tin mugs on a table and went to the iron wood-burning stove to fetch the coffee pot with one hand and then used a towel to pull a cast iron pan of biscuits out of the oven with the other. Undaunted, she tapped the front of the oven shut with one booty foot and then set about pouring coffee and putting biscuits on plates with butter and honey spread over them. Allie could taste the food before it was handed to her, the smell rich and warm as the heat seeped into her damp clothes and skin now that she settled into the empty rocker across from Agnes. Allie set the plate and mug down on the end of the table next to her with some reluctance as she placed her restless hands on her knees and smoothed away the sweat from her palms. Her tummy growled again, embarrassing her, but she wanted to listen to what Magnus had to say before she started in. "Thank you," she could hear the tears. Oh no, I just messed up the page. "Thank you," she could hear the tears in her voice as she expressed her gratitude. Oh, I will be careful. But it was clear as the old woman seated herself in a rocker that she wouldn't judge her for it. Agnes placed her plate and cup to the side on the matching end table next to her, taking a breath to speak. "It's fortunate you came when you did. Just in time for biscuits and warmth," she smiled gently. "But the thanks go to you. They left me alone here, you see, alone and without any of my charms to protect me. Whether they're only fools who know no better or hoping to do me in last, I can't say. But they, as good as set me up for a fall without my protections. Brought me home now I'm better from my illness, my heart attack, and took off once they saw I was madder than a hornet at what they had done up at my place." "What would they get from taking them? There's no money in any of them, and no reason to meddle with things that belong to their elders." Agnes looked around and sighed, observing places she seemed to find empty where Allie could see nothing amiss around the door, the windows, and off by the bed. She chuffed and sighed heavily as she looked toward the closed door. "Couldn't even leave my door alone, could they? Took away my lovely Haint Blue and replaced it with paint as red as the blood they seemed to intend to see spilled." She sniffed, annoyed, and then pressed her mouth closed in a tight line around her strong white teeth. "Well, I suppose that's why they sent you here, to help me get through the night." Allie was confused. The rich honey and butter, warm and fragrant from her biscuits, mingled with the tang of the strong coffee as they tickled her nostrils and begged her to fill her belly with them, but she waited, considering. This was what she felt at the door, something strange and tangled with the same sort of energy as that of the pumpkin men. Can't hurt to ask what it is exactly. "What do you mean, Haint Blue? I don't think I understand. What do you mean by saying someone brought me here? Who?" The woman smiled with her lips, a bitter thing, as she shook her head. "You may not know much, but you got that feel, Allie. You got a power in you that knows, even if your head hadn't caught up with the facts yet." Agnes held out her index finger, long and crooked with thick knots at the knuckle. "They're the spirits of the mountain. They guide when they choose to, and play havoc when they choose that. Some of them are ancestors and others dead who linger here, and still more are good folks of other forms. It's them that look out for us, you and me, and the others, the ones that meant us harm. The bad ones are the ones that don't know it better than to try and stay and cause harm by doing it. Those are what generally get called haints. Haint Blue is the blue that gets used on doors, windows, and ceilings to keep unwanted spirits out. And the color up till sometime before I got here, back from my convalescence, I can't say that word, that my door had been all my life, and probably long before, when my gran and granddad built this place. It tricks them, you see, stops the bad ones and the lost souls that harm without meaning to, that they've come up upon water, a thing they're forbidden to cross. The charms, oh, the charms hurt me most. I had some of them since I was a baby, each of them made by my mother's and her mother's hands, and each of them powerful from their skill. They were also some of what little I had left from my folks that come before. The rest is mostly memory now." Agnes' face fell, her eyes damp, but no tears came. Allie felt for Agnes, but she also didn't feel all that more certain about what was going on after listening to her talk about these things. Maybe it's just her age, or her way of seeing things. Allie picked up her coffee and drew a long sip of it. It was bitter and rich with notes of other things, spices that made it more complex and tasty than most of what Allie usually drank. She savored it as she thought. Strange and confusing as the old woman was, She was also clearly in need of help. Maybe she was right about Allie being brought here. She had taken on those pumpkin men what felt like ages ago and come out all right. There was also no harm in humoring Agnes if that was all she needed. Oh, there we are. She was all alone up here, and Allie understood feeling afraid when a person was alone with their only thoughts and memories for company. What do you need me to do, Agnes? The old woman lifted her eyes from the fire and picked up her cup, sipping deep. We're going to have our meal, and then we'll see what's here to work with. You want a rest after your walk, and I'll need the fuel to keep me going. After that, doing what we can, it's a matter of doing what needs to be done to get me through the night. Allie nodded and sipped more of her coffee. They were quiet as they ate, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the subtle pops and cackles it gave off as it burned. Soon they had both finished what was on their plates, and then Allie had another serving after Agnes refilled her plates without a word. She supposed it could be simple hospitality, or Agnes, knowing the way a part of the mountain was made, understood she had burned away quite a lot getting there. As she ate, the old woman covered the rest of the pan with a dishcloth, and then set about fluttering between this chest of drawers with painted signs on it. A cedar chest with its strong smell of herbs and cedar, and then out on the porch to open another chest with a creak of old hinges. She seemed to be calculating the odds, going over what she had on hand, and planning her approach. She returned to take Allie's dishes once she saw that she was through, put them in the sink, and then turned to address her with her findings. There's not much. Bastards probably didn't know what was what, thank God, but they took enough. Even the horseshoe from over the door. I'll ask you to get a fire together in the pit out front. You'll see the ring of stones, and then you'll come on back to see about the next thing. Allie nodded her head and went to find the wood pile. It was stacked just where she expected it, by an old shed adjacent to the cabin. She had to be careful of her ribs and held the wood well away from the tender side, but she managed. She knew well enough how to put together a good pile of lumber that would make a fire to last the night, and set aside a small pile nearby to feed it more if need be. It took longer than she hoped, and Agnes was sure to watch over her as she worked, but it was done before much time had passed. When Allie met her eyes, Agnes nodded her approval from where she stood on the porch, and then gestured on into the house again. That's the foundation sorted, at least after I add the old flame, a little something extra to fuel the energy. You go on in and wait while I do my work, and then we'll head on to the next thing. Then another coffee if you like. I'll make more toward nightfall. They'll be creeping in not long after that. Agnes walked off toward the fire with bundles of woven herbs in her hands, and a certain firing light emanating from her eye. Allie questioned nothing. She knew by the way the old woman carried herself that this must be granny magic, and protected magic at that. Her grand and uncle had taught her to stay out of the way when a practitioner was at work, and never to bother them with questions unless she was invited to do so when she was small. Instead, Instead, she slipped indoors and poured herself another coffee as she looked about the quiet cabin, taking it in. She could hear Agnes speaking outside, but not the words. The sound was comforting, if strange. She sipped at the hot drink and waited. Apprehension was rising somewhere inside, the sort of thing that you felt but didn't know how to interpret. She took in a long breath and let it out with a sigh. There weren't any sign of danger around her, and the cabin felt about as safe as she could hope to have found wandering from the road as she had. It would be best if she pushed these things out of her mind and let the quiet settle into her aches and bruises, she decided. Her ribs and head screamed the loudest of all these complaints, so she pulled the little travel-sized bottle of Advil from her jeans pocket and tapped out two to take a sip of coffee. As she had a little... Oh, sorry, I just turned a page. I'm struggling some of what, but seriously, get Amanda's stuff. It is really easy and nice and pleasant to read, especially after Necrosutra 2 and Pop's Golden Shower. As she had a little more of her coffee and enjoyed the calm of the warm cabin, she started to slowly rock the chair she sat in. With that comfort and the medicine taking effect, even the worst of her pains had quieted enough to slip down into the rhythms of her body. Her eyes slipped closed shortly after that. Allie was startled awake with the mug still in her hand. She quickly looked at her shirt and pants to make sure they weren't wet with coffee, but the last drag seemed to have stayed inside by luck, and because of the angle, it was tilted against her slumped body. When she looked up, she saw that Agnes' hand was firm on her shoulder. Reorientating to her surroundings, Ellie reached up to swipe a bit of drool from the side of her lips with a self-conscious readjustment of her slouched form. "It's all right. I let you rest while I worked. There's more to do now, and I'll need you for that if you're ready." Allie nodded, sleep still slipping from the edges of her mind. "Yes, but do you have a bathroom?" Agnes nodded and gestured toward the back of the cabin, where there was a short hall that way. "It's not much, but there's real plumbing." Allie stretched as she stood and then walked off to attend her needs. When Allie got back, Agnes put a cloth bag in her hand. "Here, open that up and sprinkle the salt and sage inside the cabin. It should be placed all along the thresholds of the doors and the windows to block anything from entering. I'll put some sage in the stove while you do that." Allie opened the strings of the bag and was immediately struck by the smell that infused salt gave off. It was a clean herbal smell, the kind that spoke of safe warm kitchens, salted baths, and chicken dinners. She saw that the salt was the kosher kind that came in boxes for canning and had been blended with the sage to infuse it with its properties. She stared at it for another few minutes, not sure how to go about doing as the other woman had asked her to do. She watched as Agnes tugged open the stove door with a squeal and then tossed the thick bundle of sage into the flames. The smell of it was a cleansing thing, herbal and stabilizing in a way she hadn't realized she needed. She looked back at her and held up a hand, miming holding a bag in one hand and clasping a fistful of its imaginary contents in the other before she pretended to sprinkle them carefully in a line. "It's just that and some good thoughts, I promise you." Allie nodded and then set out to do as she was shown. She started on the right side of the cabin and moved counterclockwise around the room, sprinkling the salt in clean lines at all the thresholds as she met them. She hummed to herself as she worked, some half-forgotten hymn from church she didn't remember well, but which felt right for the good thoughts she needed to go along with the sage and salt. Homey and safe meant that what she should focus on as she worked, right? Finished, Allie brought the bag over to the kitchen table and tied it shut, leaving it there as she watched the old woman dart to the door. Agnes planted a nail straight against the center of the door and then hammered it home as Allie watched. Once it was in place, she went off toward the bathroom and returned with a mirror tied on a knotted string. She raised it to the center of the door and slung the cord over the nail there. Agnes tugged gently on it to make sure it was well mounted before she walked away from it. From there, Agnes dropped to her knees in the kitchen and lugged a large bowl and a bag of bird seeds from a low cupboard in the kitchen. She got to her feet and carried these things outside. Allie followed her and watched as she dropped a good-sized pool of the seed on the ground and placed the empty metal bowl next to it with a sigh. "It ain't rice, but bird seed ought to count just as good." Agnes swept back inside the cabinet after that, where her eyes darted back and forth as she thought over all they'd done to prepare and whatever else she might have in mind. As she decided something with a nod to herself, she stopped and let her eyes settle on Allie again. "You go on out to that shed and see if there ain't any of those old bottles still in there. Mama kept every one we got from the groceries in case she needed one for bottle spells and haints. And now I've done all the same all my life. Maybe there's still some in there now." Allie went out into the yard and then into the shed, noting the way the sun had slipped down toward the bottom of the sky now that dusk was falling toward the evening as she did. She didn't know any of these charms or their purposes, but she didn't have any reason to think there was any danger. But she felt her belly lurch at the thought of being out here at night anyway. She couldn't help but think about what might have happened if she had been out in her yard the night the pumpkin men rose up. She shivered a little where she stood. The chill had gotten stronger now that the light was fading. But she didn't think that was all she felt. This was her nerves and the lingering cold fire of something telling her things were off. She took a breath and did her best to shake things off as she opened the shed door and slipped beyond the frame to scan the shelves and floor for anything remotely fitting the description of an empty bottle or vessel. Empty crate, tossed around straw, tools tools, dirt, old broom. Aha, maybe this box. She opened the top and looked inside. No, just a lot of old pictures. Whoa, that guy's something else. She lifted out the framed picture that had caught her eye and looked closer. The man was tall, had a square jaw, clearly defined cheekbones, and intense eyes like Agnes's. The black and white of old photographs, there was decidedly stranger bent to such eyes, more silver than Agnes' blue, stark and surreal. Something about him put lightning through her body just from looking at him, a natural alarm that ran all along her nerves and made it difficult to put the photograph back in the box. She let it drop back into the box with her numb fingers. Even after it was out of her hand, she found that she was looking at it with a strange haze over her mind. She had no explanation for these effects beyond the uncertainty the photograph raised and a certain anxiety the man in the picture gave her that made her skin crawl. She liked that feeling of detachment from her mind even less than the picture itself, and she chose to tackle it by folding the flaps of the box over it with 2 quick snaps of the cardboard. Free of the immediate effect, she took a couple of steps back from it and took a breath. It hadn't cleared as much as she hoped. She grunted, rolled her shoulders, shook her arms to either side of her for good measure. The sensation seemed less intolerable at least, but the unease lingered. Well, unease seems inappropriate. Seems appropriate, sorry. Allie kicked the box back toward the wall and then went about trying to scan the rest of the shed. She knew she was doing it quickly and with less care than she had before, but she needed to get away from the lingering unease of the small space, and there didn't seem to be much of anywhere could be any other boxes. There don't seem to be any bottles anywhere. I hope whatever it is she's afraid of holds off and lets her alone. With a sigh, Ellie stepped out of the shed, then closed it and latched the door behind her. Agnes was on the porch waiting for her when she came around the side of the cabin. The old woman's face was strained, her arms crossed over her chest with the obvious question in her eyes. Ellie felt bad when she shook her head in response to the old woman's anxious eyes, and felt a little worse as Agnes let out a resigned sigh, her shoulders falling in defeat. The rest we'll just have to do then. Come on inside and we'll make ready. The old woman looked out over the yard and toward what little of the sun remained on the horizon, then slipped inside as Allie followed. She slid the door closed and bolted the slot of the lock shortly thereafter. Her body a tight line of gnarled uncertainty. She quickly put together another pot of coffee and placed it on the stove before sitting back down in a rocker with her eyes turned toward the windows and door at the front of the cabin. It was clear that it was as much to watch for something creeping up on the place as it was to observe as the light faded in the distance. For the next few hours, after the light had faded through the windows, there was little more than the soft tapping of Agnes's rocking chair as she stared at the fire through the grate. The rhythmic sound of it mingled with the warmth of the fire and lulled Allie into a deep state of relaxation. With her exhaustion from her walk here, the labor of the fire building, and the stress of the last few days on top of the battle with Jamie and the pumpkin men, relaxation soon slipped into another doze and then deeper sleep. She would be startled awake soon enough. At first she thought it was Agnes who had woken her again. The old woman's hand was on her shoulder once more, after all, but she knew that this hadn't been the case as her mind began to rise back to the surface again. Some instinctual part of her alerted her to danger, something that was like the magic of Jamie's golems and also very different, a feeling that had come on the heels of a sound barely registered in her sleep, but enough to set her intuition on edge. She sat up with her back straight in the chair, her ears turned into the sounds of the night, trying to sort out if there was anything there that shouldn't be. The fire crackled on as Agnes softly made her way over to the stove, poured them fresh coffee, her deliberate and measured movements, designed to retain the quiet and some sort of sense of memory as old as her very heartbeat, stood out from her behavior during the day. It all carried the weight of tension, the same energy that made her focus dart from the door to the window to the roof and then within as she listened to all of it. It hadn't been Allie's imagination yet then, but if that was so, what had it been? There was another crackle from outside, the sound of wood as it burned, and then a pop of a knot as it burst in the flames that made both of them startle in response. Agnes came close to her with coffee in hand and ducked down to speak close to her ear. I lit it up as you slept. I wanted the extra light outside and the protection both. Glad I lit it when I did, just in time by the feel. Something's out there now, feeling along the edges of all the work we did, looking for a way in. Be quiet and listen a while longer and you'll feel it too. She already did. It was the feel of a finger placed along the outer walls of the cabin, slowly and deliberately pulled along them, the way a child will slip her index finger over their sales tags and shelf edges in a grocery store, but with none of the innocent sense of exploration and clear feeling of that same sensation also tracing along her energy. This energy held malice and foreboding. There was another pop from the bonfire outside, a solid thunk as the wood fell into itself as it burned down. A growing breeze rose up and down as it built and stirred the trees into susurration behind and above the cabin, blended with the hoot of an owl, the soft tread of some forest animal as it slunk through the woods. The thunk crack of a deer running away into the night as it broke through the underbrush in its hurry, and the creak of the first porch step as something set its foot down outside and then began to stir the birdseed piled at the side of the bottom step. Plink, plink, plink. There was a low, deep sigh of exasperation, clearly male and all too human with its renaissance. Agnes' hand tangled with Allie's suddenly, her face alert, and her other hand wrapped too tightly around the tin mug she had been about to hand her, now forgotten. Plink, plink, plink. This, Allie realized, was the sound of birdseed hitting the inside of the metal bowl one by one, as if the man, or a thing that sounded like a man, was tossing them there bit by bit. Agnes, you better believe I'm going to get you for this pile of birdseed once I'm through. It's been a while, but I'm not so long I don't remember what you done. The old woman's eyes shone with new light. Something made up of fear and uncertainty had been pulled to the surface. This voice represented a realization of something she'd been fighting not to consider and had been helplessly consumed by underneath all of her self-assured attention to detail before the dark. This voice was familiar to her, familiar and very old. Allie thought of the old pictures in the shed, of cold gray eyes that fixed a person where they stood, locked and afraid under their weight. She didn't know that voice or what it meant, but she felt the weight of its intent crawl along her nerve endings just the same. It laughed cold and deep with a Renaissance bass. Plink, plink, I will never forget, Agnes, you know that? Plink, plink. Nowhere for either of us to go all these years. You always come back and I always follow. That's our way. We're family after all. Another chuckle as deep as the first. Plink, 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 pop, crackle, plink, plink, plink. The wind rose again. Somewhere far off an animal howled, long and high. Still they heard it as the voice breathed from the porch steps. As it counted out the bird seeds one by one. Allie's hand cracked as Agnes gripped tightened and moved the bones of her hand into tangled knots. Uncomfortable with tension, but not painfully so, not yet. Yes, the voice was old, the kind of old that turns an old woman into a little girl she was when this voice was her constant hunter. You're not alone, Agnes. She doesn't know me, but she sees my face in her head. Oh, the picture, your mother's pictures. Agnes' eyes met Allie's by the light of the stove, scared and questioning. Allie could only nod her head. Yes, I saw them. Yes, I saw him in that dark shed in the final hours of daylight. I know him, but I don't know him. I don't understand this. I don't understand why this is all too familiar. Like there's some part of me that's me and another part that is somebody else. I don't. The tin mug of coffee fell from Agnes' hand down to spill its contents on the floor. They both startled at the sound as it hit, and then dully rang as it skirted a little further beyond the pool of coffee. Allie breathed deep as she closed her eyes. Remember the pumpkin men. Remember how you were afraid and you won anyway. Don't you remember you were strong and you were brave, even though there were so many of them and Jamie to fight? There were so many, and this is only one. One, yes, only. No, I don't think you understand what you're facing yet, girl. Maybe I do, and maybe I don't. It was out of her mouth before she'd been aware she opened her mouth to speak. The words alien and far away from the person she felt herself to be. Maybe you don't know who or what I am. Agnes' eyes locked into her. At first they pleaded for her to stop, and then they looked deeper to try and puzzle out what happened. What changed about Allie? There was nothing to read beneath the surface, just Allie and whatever it was she came here for, and not even Allie knew what that entailed. It breathed again and plucked seed after seed down into the bowl as he counted them. The fire crackled as it flared into a new life. One of the logs thumped as it broke up and tumbled, either out of the stack or further inside it as the fire worked at the wood. The strong, fresh smell of sage and warm salt came from every threshold in the cabin, and the ghost of the burnt sage still lingered from when it was thrown into the stove. These things underlined a certain power that was raised when it was called, barred the man from coming inside as his energy ran itself along the lines of protection and sought entrance all the same. Now Allie thought of a mountain lion as it paced and ran its shoulders along the edges of things, with its eyes directly on whatever it was it hunted. The wind blew down off of the mountain and ran its fingers through the trees behind and over the house, lingered, and then pushed on into the valley and the hollers below. The owl had gone silent and the other animals with them, but something still shuffled and cracked in the dark of the night, and the footsteps rang out from the woods to accompany the Haint on Agnes's porch with their clear minutes. Those were troubling things without true names or forms, imitators and tricksters who knew they were found out and cared not. There was no way to know the hour beyond whatever light there was, and clearly daylight was hours away. The weight of the Haint and the other entities was dense and unyielding, their energies aggressively close and yet held beyond the shields the two women made to shut them out. Plink, plink went the seeds into the bowl. Hush, hush went the trees in the wind. Nothing changed about the world outside of the cabin, and yet everything had. Allie's mind was a hazy thing, thick with something she couldn't name, but which she knew she dare not resist. Some forces moved to meet their ends, and Agnes was their sacred charge as much as the Haint was a representative of all the dark things that moved around the mountain around them. That girl belongs to me. I came for what I'm due. I was owed it long ago. I'm going to stop there because it's just over halfway through. It's been about 40 minutes. Yay! And, if I was listening to that, I would want to buy that story and find out what happened next. So check out Amanda's stuff down below. I don't know who we're having next week because I haven't checked my inbox. I will do that. Authors, don't forget you can submit year-round. Basically, I'll read nearly anything. Obviously, I do have some limits. Not necrophilia or incest or bestiality. It's more on if you're a horrible person. I know you're a horrible person. I'm not touching your stuff. You can find someone else to promote you. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Don't forget to hit the subscribe. Hit the subscribe. Yay! Nice palate cleanse from Amanda Lyons. Yay! After that terror that was Kevin Sweeney and Reek. So yay! Thank you, Amanda M. Lyons. Hit subscribe. See you next week. Oh, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Hit subscribe. Yay! Hit subscribe. Subscribe.